Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. We are recording. My name is Michelle Markle. I'm the Youth Transition Program Coordinator with Vocational Rehabilitation. Really appreciate everybody being here today. We have important information to cover with all of you. I'm here with our wonderful University of Oregon folks, but just to save time, I'm going to also introduce Sherry Boyd here. Sherry, if you want to just say a quick hello. She's our VR Youth and Workforce Manager here as well.
Hello, for everyone I have not yet met. It's a pleasure to be joining today. Again, Sherry Boyd, VR Workforce Youth Manager.
Oh, we're pinned. That's weird. All right. I'm going to share screen here. We have got a lot of content to cover today. And so I also just want to call out that we have a wider audience than typical today. We invited, of course, we have our transition specialists, VRCs, any team members, but we specifically reached out to administrators and business office folks as well today. So our group is wider, the audience is wider. The content today is intended to speak to each of your roles and positions. So bear with us as we go along here. There is a lot that we're going to be covering. We are asking you please to put questions into the chat and hold any unmute, ask questions until the end, because a lot of the questions you might be anticipating, hopefully we've covered in the slides, and hopefully we have time for questions. All right, sharing of screen. Do you see the slides?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Okay, here we go. So I wanted to start off right off the bat with some definitions, because we are covering a lot today, and hopefully it doesn't get too confusing. You're going to hear me talk a lot about RSA. RSA is Rehabilitation Services Administration. This is VR's governing body at the federal level. So this audit that we got, it's called monitoring, was a federal audit by these folks. And the report that we just got back were the findings and corrective actions, essentially. VR is vocational rehabilitation, potentially eligible. That's a student who is age 14 to 21 with a documented disability that has not yet applied for VR. In plan status means a youth who's found eligible for VR and has an individual plan for employment. Duplication of service is the concept of when VR is paying for something that's required by IDEA and school services, specific to this topic today. It means something much broader, but for today, that's what we're talking about. Policy, when we talk about policy, we're talking about VR policy. Which is going to need to be reviewed and approved by RSA. So when we talk about updating policy going forward, VR will have to submit all of this to our federal governing body for approval. And TA is technical assistance, which is provided by the National Technical Assistance Network, the Collaborative, or NTACT-C, as many of you may have heard of it. Okay, so I just want to start off by saying that we've been waiting nearly a year and a half for this report. We were monitored in February, March of 22. We did our very best to try and give you the information that we were anticipating, sharing with you a little bit at Fall Regionals about how Pre-ETS would probably take a much more primary role in our partnerships and contracts. Specifically with our administrator and business office committee of practice had shared that our contracting methods would likely be changing. And now we know that these things are true and they are required. The timing is terrible. We know this, but we needed to let you guys know just as soon as we did, because this impacts all of us. We didn't have any control over the timing. I just want everybody to know that as well. So we shared the information with you the same day that we got the report. And it's been only 12 days since we've had it, so there still are a fair amount of unknowns. We appreciate your attention. to everything that we're talking about and helping to understand it and ask the questions. We really do appreciate your questions because we want to be able to answer those. So if you have the question, put it in the chat. We are collecting them. We're preparing an FAQ. We want to get answers to you guys. And just one final note before I dive in here, the tone of all of this actually feels really kind of yucky. I don't know how to say it. One of the things that was pointed out to us time and again was that we use the collaborative language that we use in our contracts, made it look like VR was giving up its authority or was not in control of its own service or dollars. So you'll hear a lot about VR authority. Our contracts will have to look, they won't be so like flowery in words and stuff like that. I say this just to know that we still want to collaborate with you. We know that you're our partners. We believe that you're our partners and that you need to be a part of all of this. All right. Internal controls. This is another definition, needed a whole entire slide to itself. This is basically how we show to the federal government that on a day-to-day basis, we have processes and procedures in place that serve to safeguard against fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement of dollars. That's kind of like the bottom line with this. So you're going to hear us talk quite a bit about those, but it's basically just how we put policy into practice. Those also will need to be written, submitted to RSA, and approved before they become real. I stuck a slide in here about Pre-ETS, a couple of them, just because I didn't know who was on the call and what your understanding of it is. But when we talk about Pre-ETS, it stands for Pre-Employment Transition Services. These are the 5 required skills that we're talking about when we talk about Pre-ETS. VR is required to spend 15% of our federal dollars on the provision of Pre-ETS. A little bit more for those of you who don't know, they're the earliest set of VR services. They are for students enrolled in secondary or post-secondary schools ages 14 to 21. They're short-term in nature. I covered the other stuff already. Currently, our YTP contracts cover Pre-ETS, they cover transition services, and they cover employment services. This is one of the areas that we don't know quite yet if our future YTP contracts will continue to include all of these services or will solely be for Pre-ETS. One of the things that's really important to understand in all of this is that we have for a long, long time referred to YTP as a grant. And it started as a grant in 1990, and it's been operating as a grant ever since. In fact, our 2019 procurement that we're still running off of uses the word grant. And we learned that we cannot use federal dollars to subgrant. So a grant is no more. We're going to be moving towards contracts. Okay, so in 2014, WI reauthorized, and we were required to offer Pre-ETS. In 2015, we began offering these with very little guidance on how to provide the services. So we wrote contracts with districts, we stuck in what we thought we knew, and we've been rolling on that since. Just now in our audit report, we learned that not a grant, can't be treated as a grant, must be a contract. We look back at our history a little bit. Like I said, we were operating as a grant early on. In 2019, it still says grant in our paperwork, but we did move towards more of like a fixed fee reimbursement contract where our total 2-year budgets were divided by 8 and districts got that allotment. VR was not requesting financial backup for expenditures until this biennium in July of 21, where we started a real cost reimbursement contract model. That's our current status. So now, hopefully all of you realize we are collecting actual expense reports and time verification reports from each of you guys before we submit payment. And yeah, before I go there, I want you to look at this timeline, right? RSA reviewed years 2018 through 2020, including contracts that started as early as 2016 and 2017. So just take a second and think about where you were in those years, 2016, 2018. That was a really long time ago, and it was right after WIOA was reauthorized and we didn't have a ton of guidance. So they were auditing and reviewing our contracts from that time period. The changes that we had begun implementing in 2021 weren't considered as part of it. We submitted them later. RSA said great steps toward what you're working on, but it didn't go far enough. So we did end up with 6 findings relating to YTP that require corrective action. A summary of these, and the report is public. So if any of you want to get on and read it, it's 80 some pages long. You are totally welcome to do that. But here we are with a summary for you. VR was not authorizing, documenting, or reporting type of service provided and VR status for each student. VR wasn't using a rate methodology to pay for contracted Pre-ETS providers, including YTP transition specialists. VR used the wrong pot of money, Pre-ETS, for some services, including administrative services. And VR was not requiring YTP contractors to account for their time. And we have 6 corrective actions that we've got to take. I'll just roll right into these. Number 1 is immediately cease using Pre-ETS funds for the provision of any Pre-ETS until all corrections are made and approved by RSA. When I say all the corrections, that's all these other ones right down below here following. Number 2, revise written policies that govern the manner in which VR sets fees for payment of services. Please know I'm going to break these down more in detail after I read them here. Number 3, develop and implement written internal controls and mechanisms to allow VR to track the services purchased and provided for each student. Amend and revise contracts to ensure all Pre-ETS are provided in accordance with federal law. Number 5, within contracts, include requirements for tracking expenditures per service per student. And number 6, develop methods of tracking administrative costs to ensure they are appropriate and allowable. Now I'm going to break down each of these with a little more detail. Checking time. Okay, cease using Pre-ETS funds immediately. So that means we cannot, as of the day we got the report, spend any more Pre-ETS dollars until we make all of these fixes and they're approved by RSA. So VR is using other federal dollars to pay for the current YTP contracts that end this month, June of 2023, as well as the 23-24 extensions. We will only be able to use Pre-ETS again once brand new RSA approved contracts are in place. VR is still required to spend 15% of our federal dollars on Pre-ETS. And if we don't, our overall budget shrinks in future years. So it is critical that we are able to turn that lever back on. VR, we are aiming for October 1st to have new contracts in place. And at that point, then all of the 23-24 extensions would be terminated and replaced with the new contracts. Come on. My slideshow froze. There we go. All right, fees and rates. This is a really big deal. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions about this. And for all of you, if you have questions, I'm your contact person. It's really important that you contact me. I'm assigned to be the contact for all of our YTP contract partners. Sherry Boyd is assigned to be the contact for internal VR folks. If we have any VRCs or branch managers on here, that's Sherry. Okay, New contracts won't be able to pay salary and benefits that are based on your collective bargaining agreements. Reimbursable rates will be based on policy and will be more standardized across the state. VR must justify reasonableness of rates. Some districts are going to benefit from this, and others may need to assume more of the cost. We do have examples from other states to show you shortly so that you can kind of start to understand how we're thinking about this. VR's goal in this endeavor is to pay fairly and in line with other like services while keeping the option for YTP open to as many students as possible. Tracking of services. On the front end, so before a service is provided, each service to each student will need to be pre-approved by an employee of VR. This process is called verification and authorization. VR youth team members will do this for students who are not yet in plan. So that's like me and CJ and Desi and Tony and Whitney and Mandy. And VRCs will do this for students who are eligible for VR. On the back end, evidence of completion of each service will need to be submitted and align with what was approved. Only then will VR be able to pay for the service. So there's a front end increase in process and paperwork and a back end. We do, I'm going to get to this in a moment, but we have this portal we're purchasing that should hopefully make this manageable. Number 4, revised contracts. Amending is not an option for us. We're on the last year that we can amend based on our original procurement from 2019. So we will need new contracts with each site that ensure the provision of Pre-ETS is in accordance with federal law. One very large piece of this will be defining how Pre-ETS aren't duplicating IDEA services. RSA said they were unable to determine whether or not our YTP contracts were a duplication of service, and that VR needs policy and internal controls to ensure this isn't happening. VR is receiving technical assistance on this and does not yet have this defined. Okay, expenditures. Our contracts and payment practices will need to be able to show this level of detail. Which student, which Pre-ETS or other VR service, was the student potentially eligible for VR, or was the student eligible and in plan with VR? And how much time and how many dollars for each of the services. So we're going to need to get much more detailed than what we have. Administrative costs. You're going to hear it maybe if we talk a lot now about reasonable, allowable, allocable, necessary. So administrative costs must be reasonable. Reasonable means rates are consistent and justifiable. They must be allowable. The federal dollars being used for payment allow this expense. So depending on which pot of money we're using, there are different rules. Pre-ETS have lots and lots of rules. Allocable means, is it something VR is able to delegate to another organization or agency? Necessary means, is it required for the provision of services? VR policy approved by RSA will be determining this. Really important to note here, you guys, that indirect is no longer allowable unless districts can provide the exhaustive list of what indirect pays for, and VR can determine these are allowable expenses. So more to come on that, but the general idea is VR shouldn't be paying for the electricity or the copier contract. And so I don't know, right? So each district's going to have to submit what they use their indirect for, and VR will have to determine what, if any, of the portions of that are allowable. All right. How are the contracts going to be different? You all saw this in the letter, but I am going to talk through this again really quickly. They will run on the federal fiscal year, October through September. So we still do want to have a rhythm of 2-year agreements. So for us, I know that does not align with school budgeting at all, but this is something that is a non-negotiable that we have to do and we have to fix. They may only be for the provision of pre-ETS. We haven't decided that yet. If that were the case, we want everybody to understand that it would only be for students enrolled in secondary or post-secondary school, ages 14 to 21. So that does mean disengaged youth or dropouts or students or people who aren't in school would not be eligible if we're going the direction of pre-ETS only. There may be caps on allowable costs for materials and supplies. VR staff will need to verify and authorize each service provided to each student before the service is provided and before VR renders payment. VR must retain documentation of these actions. More. Contracts can no longer pay for salary and benefits without the associated time being directly linked to the provision of service. In other words, for contracting, VR can only pay for services, not for people or FTE. As such, our contracts will either be switching to a fee-for-service model or a cost per student model. Cost per student is what we use in the summertime with RFA, just for a frame of reference. Contracts will no longer allow districts to spend down extra dollars for anything other than the direct provision of pre-ETS. So our end of biennium spend downs in the future probably will not be existing in our contracts. They are happening right now. They can continue to happen right now. VR has earmarked other dollars to allow these things to happen right now. These changes we're talking about will be whenever we have a new contract in place. Status quo for the time being until we get a new contract in place, right? And potentially there may not be a requirement for matching funds from school districts in order to have a YTB contract. We're looking into the pros and cons of that. If we do that, it is important to understand that there would be an impact on VR's maintenance of effort a couple of years from now. But there isn't really an easy path forward that doesn't have some impact, right? So it's kind of VR's looking at which impact makes the most sense. All right, whew, that's a lot. That's a lot. We've been getting questions, and these are some of the ones that we are getting the most regularly that we wanted to address right off the bat. Do YTP teams stop spending now? No. Continue spending, continue doing your job, business as usual, currently right now for this month. Your 23-24 contracts are just coming out from our Office of Procurement, and business as usual when your district signs those and gets those back to us as well, right? So is there money to fund YTP beginning July 1st? And for summer RFA, yes, there is. Both of those things will be business as usual. It's business as usual until we get new contracts. Is there money to cover the entire 23-24 contract if needed? If this takes longer than we thought, if we submit it to RSA and they take a long time to get back to us? Yes, there is money to cover the entire 23-24 contract if needed. Can districts choose to opt out of YTP when new contracts are developed? Yes, but we really don't want you to. So if you have questions, please continue to ask them. If you have needs and want to weigh in on this, share those with me as well. When are we aiming to have new contracts in place? We have an incredibly ambitious goal to have new contracts in place October 1st. And at that point is when our extensions would terminate and be replaced by a new contract if we're able to pull it off. And what is this rate going to be? If we're talking about rates and rate methodology and consistent rates, what will that rate be? That is to be determined, but we do understand that it's a really big deal. So I want to just dive a little bit deeper into this right now. This is the thinking. This is the thinking we want everybody to join us in. And it's a mind shift. VR can't pay for salary and benefits in contracts. VR can pay for services. Who provides services? People provide services, right? So in order for us and for you to forecast a budget, salary and benefits must be translated into per student and or per service costs. And that is possible. For YTP, VR is first exploring a fee for hours of service pre-ETS model. So it's a fee for hours of service, which is going to just look a whole lot like tracking your time with much more detail than you ever have. You submit your time, and then that creates an invoice. That's kind of what this could look like. Our new contracts would identify a minimum number of students, a maximum number of hours, and an overall not to exceed budget. Districts would have flexibility in hours allocated towards VR services. All right, come on. Oh boy, there we go. Here are some examples. I know when I first heard about this, I went straight to, well, how do we budget for it? And so we wanted to share with you an example and a couple of samples that you can start thinking about this. There are two approaches in the fee-for-service model. One, like the top here, where you have a fee for the service, for the hour of service. Texas is $30 an hour. Washington is $55 an hour. Travel, lodging, materials have their own line item on the budget. They're outside of that. In the second model, where Pennsylvania is at $50 an hour and Ohio is at $67 an hour, travel, lodging, and materials are included inside of the rate. Okay, it's really important. This is really, like, when I'm talking about budget and these kind of things, this is more for admin and our business office folks who are on here, transition specialists. This is high-level budgeting stuff. It's really important to know that this wouldn't be your hourly rate. This wouldn't be your hourly wage. When we're talking about a rate, what's built into the rate is an hourly wage and its benefits. So it's your dental, your vision, your medical, it's your PERS, retirement. It's all of those extra costs that are above and beyond your hourly wage. So when we're looking at these rates, that stuff is inside, not in addition. It's inside the rate, not in addition to the rate. For projection, I've started playing with these, thinking about when I was in a school and the school calendar. So if you follow the formula of number of hours per week times rate times week per year, you as a district can say, here's how many hours a week I'd need at which rate for how many weeks per year in order to be reimbursed for the cost that I'm typically used to getting, or I won't get it, or I might get more than it. But you can start playing with some of these. And I put an example down here just so that you could see. This is an example of 30 hours a week. So that's like 0.75 at a rate of $50 an hour times 46 weeks. 46 weeks still gives somebody 4 weeks off in summer, Christmas break, spring break, which is more typical. A district could be reimbursed around $69,000 then, if that's the case. Remember, there's all these extra requirements of pre-approval and paperwork submission, but this just gives you something to think about. We do have some good news. We have already started this work and we have a strong support network working with us. Again, it's the NTACT-C folks. We have TA providers who are experts in this, who are highly available, who will be coming out to Oregon, who are championing and cheerleading our success in this process and our ability to stay partners with all of you. Doing a quick time check. Okay, so where we are right now, these things are already underway. Of course, this is our last month working with U of O. We had to transfer our contractual authority from U of O to VR, and we've been working on that all year now. And that becomes official July 1. We are very near, if not signing, a contract for a vendor portal with Alliance. Alliance is like your ESIS, your student information systems, your Synergy. We have Orca. Alliance owns Orca. So we're purchasing a portal where transition specialists will be able to directly enter things. We approve it. It creates invoices, so it isn't us shuffling back big packages of paper back and forth. And don't think about that in your brains. We're trying to modernize this and make it more efficient. That's part of why we waited for all of this as well. Internal control for verification and authorization of Pre-ETS is already in use internally with our TTAN partners and with our RFA contracts. We deliberately waited on doing this with YTP because of the scale. We just, last quarter was over 8,000 Pre-ETS or something. We needed the tool of the portal, and we needed some extra hands and bodies with the team that we're going to be hiring to help us manage that shift. Communications have gone out to all of the YTP sites. If you're paying attention to who's on the call and you see people missing, please tell them to come to the June 26th community of practice. That one actually is specifically for admin and business only, though. This is also recorded and it will be posted on the University of Oregon website, where we always have our community of practice materials.
Until the end of June.
Until the end of June. And then we have actually a pretty awesome looking VR website where this will be housed under past events.
Will the slides be on here also? Okay.
Yeah,
We've
slides
got
will be up here
questions
too.
about the slides on the
Recording and slides will be available. All right, so here's the rhythm that we're going to be getting into here. Our strategy is we hear from RSA what we need to do. We meet with our TA folks. They send us in strong directions that set us up for success. We are creating an internal youth planning team in VR that I'll show you in a moment who the reps are going to be. Not the people, but the roles. And we will be forming a small focus group of YTP partners as well to help us weigh in on some of the stuff. We're on such an accelerated timeline to try and pull this off quickly that we're going to be maybe skipping several best practice steps that we would normally want to do. And so I just ask for your forgiveness and understanding in that we've got to work really quickly to get this stuff done. In VR, these will be the folks who are helping us figure this out. So do know we're not alone. Do know that the changes are significant enough that it's going to touch all of us in VR. So it'll be the youth manager, it'll be my role, it'll be CJ, and then it'll be a representative from each of these additional departments or roles, if you will. Externally, we're going to be looking for one of the following from each VR regions. We have 3 regions in VR, kind of like Portland Metro out to the coast, and then it's the Valley all the way down, and then it's all of like Central and Eastern. That's kind of the way that I think of it. So we want a transition specialist, a YTP transition specialist, YTP administrator, YTP business office rep, as well as a non-YTP RFA contract rep from each of the 3 regions. We will be outreaching to specific people in order to ensure balance of district size, perspective, and location, as well as depth of understanding of YTP and Pre-ETS. That's going to be our process. And just to show you again, kind of to hit it home here, we're getting technical assistance. We update our policies. We write internal controls. We review these things with RSA. Once RSA approves and gives us the green light, the thumbs up, then we plan and provide training. So there's still going to be a delay in training on new things because we need to make sure that we're training to the right thing and the thing that is approved. Further communications and connections. Just a reminder again that for YTP administrators and business office folks, we have a community practice scheduled for June 26th, 11 a.m. to noon. That's on Zoom. If you need the invite or the link, shoot me an email and I'll make sure that you get that. You'll probably get 7,000 updates, and I apologize for that. I do try and just send them to new people, but I don't know what happens on the back end. We also have our YTP office hours that are for all YTP contracted partners every other Monday, noon to 12:30 p.m. and every other Wednesday, 3 to 3:30 p.m. if you have questions, we have time for questions. We definitely have time for questions. But I do want to remind everybody that the questions really, they do need to come to me at this point. That's just a quality control kind of thing. There's a lot of processing going on, right? This is so much and it is really different. And we just want to make sure to dispel myth, to myth bust, to not get rumors started, that all the questions come to me for our YTP contracted partners. And if you are internal with VR, that they go to Sherry Boyd. All right, what do we have in the chat?
Oh, this is Rochelle from Tillamook. Sorry, I didn't put it in the chat, but my question was, admin costs.
About answering some of the questions in the chat.
Oh, put it in the chat.
We have enough time right now to unmute and go ahead and take questions as well. But in the chat, it is really nice to have those because I'll save the chat and your questions from the chat will go into our FAQ, but feel free to go ahead and unmute and ask as well. So continue on.
Okay. So admin costs, are the YTP specialists considered admin, or is admin like our special ed director or our finance person, or?
Yeah, administrative costs are more like for managing the contract or any kind of secretarial or administrative support. That way it could be, it's not the transition specialist time. So when they're designing and delivering and documenting their pre-ETS, that's all counted within pre-ETS delivery. And we are going to get really close. We're going to have to get, and I'm actually kind of excited about this, but we're going to have to get really crystal clear on what is pre-ETS coordination, what's arranging for a pre-ET, what's delivery of service for a pre-ET, how do we document our pre-ETs without it becoming an administrative cost or situation. And that's all going to have to be actually written out in the contract. So we will get a lot more clear about that. We're not there yet. We are absolutely 100% using a lot of the work that we did at Fall Regionals. Remember, those of you who were there, we said, what do you do with your time? How would you organize this by pre-ETS or pre-ETS coordination or arranging for? So we're actually using a lot of that stuff as the backbone for where we're headed, so that for sure our contracts and the flow of money is going to look different. That will not be business as usual, but hopefully your services don't look too different in how you're working with students and families and the services that they're getting. Okay. Next, or other questions from the chat?
There seems to be a lot of questions that I'll try to summarize, but they're around, will there be a different rate for small districts, and what about their numbers fluctuating?
Yes. We don't have that stuff figured out yet. For forecasting for both VR and for you guys, we do want to come up with minimal rate variation, but we can have some rate variation. The example our TA providers continue to express is like in rural areas, if significantly more travel is required, you may offer a higher rate of reimbursement if you're wrapping travel costs into the rate, for instance. So it is possible. We do not have that figured out. Districts that are really small, we've had a requirement for 0.5 FTE commitment in the past. This would actually eliminate that requirement. So it might be open to even smaller or different districts, which will be a good thing. We don't have all of that figured out yet, but that's an excellent question. And I hope I touched on it well enough. What else do we have?
Would it be helpful, Michelle, if I just started reading the questions, and between you and I, we can toggle back and forth? Okay. So starting from the top, I had copy pasted what was in one of the slides. One of the questions was, will VR have set salary and benefit costs? The answer to that was in the slide, that VR is no longer able to pay for salary and benefits without the associated time being directed to the service and the student. Another, will the slides be available? Yes. Do you anticipate hiring more VRCs? So I can certainly start this. There was a governor ask. So in the legislative session, we are part of the governor's recommended budget in receiving 5 FTE. So VR has been approved for a youth manager and 4 positions that will be the work that the TAPs have completed, as well as additional expectation of their work. So they will be that trainer and that connector between the VR offices and our partners. And when we talk about the verification and authorization needed for all of those students for their services, those will be additional resources to the youth team that will be able to provide that. Hopefully, one of the messages talked about paper shuffling and additional ask. Hopefully, we will be creating a seamless process in which you're connected with the student, you put the request into the portal. We will then have resource on the back end from VR to go ahead and verify and authorize those services and get that yes right back to you so you can start providing services. So we're not imagining that to be too much more of a time indicator and can be done with the student, right? So we think about, retraining our way of work, in that while we're with the student, we can be making those requests and we can be accounting for the time spent with student and what we're imagining in our fee-for-service hourly model. Another question, if a cost per service or cost per student model, how will this affect small schools in rural areas? So we talked about that, of the equity of service. One of the areas that Michelle and I continue to get technical assistance in is that reasonableness, right? So you heard Michelle describe what's reasonable. And if you're providing services to students in a larger geographical area, it's going to be known that it's going to take you more time and attention to get to those students to provide those services. So that will all be in consideration when determining what those rate models are and what's reasonable. Does service include travel to all of those districts? So of course, we will be including in what that new model is, those travel costs, as well as what you need to provide that service. So we think about resources, curriculum. We are considering all of that when we are looking to set rates reasonably across the state. Everyone wants this recording of you, Michelle. Will a new application be required? So I'm going to punt this one to Michelle. Will a new application be required for the new contract? Hopefully October 2023.
That is not yet decided either, because if we keep it just with schools, we can do what's called a direct appoint, which I am a humongous fan of because it saves several steps. If we open it up to people other than schools, then we would have to do a more formal procurement process, and there would be an application that's not yet determined. A lot of this, we're learning, right? How many people will be interested? Are new districts interested? We still have a requirement to spend the 15% and get the services out to the students. So we've got to think a little bit bigger and just differently. So that's not yet determined, but it could go either way.
Another question on that, Michelle. Will contracts be competitive, or can we write these new contracts together as a team, since it will be entirely new for all of us? I can't imagine trying to do this as a new YTP specialist.
Yeah. It's kind of the same answer as the last one, is if we go through procurement, there are specific rules and regulations and prohibitions that happen. Depending on the timing of when things are submitted, there's an ability to team and negotiate around the services, and some of the I guess the models and rates. If we go with a per student cost, like with RFA, if we land on a fee for service, it's going to be a lot simpler kind of math. There's going to be a floor of students you must provide services to, and a ceiling you can't exceed, and lots of wiggle room in the middle of all of that. I don't know if I answered that. So competitive, it would be competitive only if we go with the procurement route and open it up to more than just schools.
Another question in the chat, how does having to get pre-approval authorization for every student, every service offered to each student play into the time? And I took that one. I also want to recognize that this isn't optional. This is one of the areas that RSA was very clear in describing, that VR must prove the authority that we are authorizing those services. So at current, you as a transition specialist have clear access to students. You know absolutely if they're on an IEP, 504, have a documented disability, and it's been best practice that you connect with those students. What RSA response is our authority over that work before that work can begin. So that's a contractual piece in which VR can't subdelegate that authority, and VR must be the verifier and authorizer of services being purchased. So we are hoping to create a system that enhances that, in that we aren't asking for duplication of work. Currently, you're using the database with the U of O, intern plan now, the Microsoft Forms. And so we're imagining the same system in which you would put the request in, you would receive the approval from, you would document what services you're providing, and the system would be able to invoice for those services. So hopefully not a lot of paper pushing, as the comment indicated, less resource access to the resource so that you can have direct access to those students. Great question.
And I think this is going to be one of the trickiest things to make efficient and actually functional. So I can imagine hours allotted to pre-ETS coordination, where a transition specialist can still do some outreach and before it becomes an individualized service. So you're doing outreach and you're teaming, that's pre-ETS coordination. And then when it comes down to an individual student you're wanting to work with, you submit something to VR. Ideally, in my brain, we come up with something that's maybe like a pre-ETS plan for the year. So it covers like the year's worth of services. So you don't need to come back and get pre-approval for every single service that you're requesting. We've had it 12 days. That is not a fully formed idea, but I think that that's an approach that is still manageable, instead of like considering every service, every student all the time doing this. How do we make it functional for ourselves? For sure, we're open to ideas if you have ideas around that. I will just say right now, sometimes people go like, oh, just get a signature at the IEP meeting, a permission signature at every IEP meeting. That will not work for us anymore because it's not VR considering, verifying, authorizing. So it's not going to look like that. That can't be our solution. We need to think of a way in which then VR interfaces with that and helps make a plan from there.
Next question, can you say more about how it is that we continue spending in a business as usual approach? And I'll just begin that one. The business as usual is current status, that until we have guidance and expectation of a new contract, we're asking that continue contracting as our amendments begin on July 1 is business as usual. So when we make these significant shift and change, you will have the information you need to be able to determine what the next step in the spending would be. So I hope that answers that. So that business as usual is that this is what's coming, but today we're operating in our current understanding of our contract.
I see a couple of questions in here that are around like HR or license versus classified and salaries and rates and all of that. So this is the part that's going to be really, really different. And I want to be completely transparent so everybody's making informed choices here. Every district in the past, what we've allowed is every district submits whatever their hourly wage is based on their collective bargaining agreement. And that was considered unreasonable. And so we have to come up with rates. You will all still be, and everything that we're talking about here, you will still be an employee of your school district. So whatever collective bargaining agreement you're in will still apply. This that we're talking about, VR doesn't actually have any control over that. What VR can impact and try and help everybody understand is how this model can translate into a predictable, reimbursable income revenue really still for the district. And so if you want to dive a little bit deeper into that, this is for business folks. I need to talk with business folks and admin about this. If you want to dive a little bit deeper into that, contact me so that we can talk through those things. But that for transition specialists, those are questions for your admin and for your business office folks, because they're employment related decisions and they are your employer. VR is not your employer.
All right. When we wrap up materials into the service rate for Pre-ETS, do those materials need to follow similar rules that are currently required under VR rules?
From any example I can think of, yes, probably with probably not quite as creative, especially if you're considering like some of our spend down project money. We have been able to get quite creative and flexible with that. We've been still writing on the concept of COVID flexible spending. And that for sure is coming to an end at the end of this month. And we'll be going back to our typical federal dollar spending plans. And then once we have the new contract in place, that stuff's going to be spelled out with much greater clarity. But if you're just talking about curriculum, Pre-ETS curriculum, that's what we've all been focusing on. Yeah, that kind of stuff is still a part of the story and can be funded.
Another question about pre-approval. Does that mean every Pre-ETS and every student needs to be approved? And I think Michelle covered that. It is a requirement that VR show the authority and control of those services, but it may be set, as Michelle had described, in a plan so that you can have a way in which to plan for all the services that would be approved. So when RSA comes with that expectation, they come in assuring that VR isn't duplicating any services that are expected to be delivered under IDEA. So IDEA has transition service expectation, as does WIOA, which is where VR lands, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. So when we are verifying that the student meets definition of student with disability, that's the verification part, and then VR must authorize. And we do that by learning what services are being provided within the school and what services can be provided in VR and what can we stack without duplicating. I hope that explains that a little bit more. How will coaching and technical support of YTP specialists be structured under the new system? So coaching and TA is going to take on the role by those new appointed position that we have now been waiting for in the legislative session. So when those 4 new positions are hired within VR, those are the positions that will provide that technical assistance and support to our contractors as well as to our VR staff.
I see 2 questions that I'd like to address here. James says, if the rate level determined is above or below CBA rates in a district, would a district then have to make rules around how to address the difference? The way that I think of this, having been a former administrator, is that in this model that we're moving toward, the district is assuming the cost of whomever you're hiring. It's a district employee. One person or multiple people could provide a VR service if it's approved. And then the district gets rates back. So you are assuming a greater financial risk differently than what we've done in the past, where it was more like a grant and you could count on these dollars coming back into you. You can actually budget it as a revenue. The shift of mind that we have to think about now is that there is still a revenue stream, but it requires the completion and documentation of a service, and it's linked to the hours. It's all still possible, it's just different. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I also saw from Michelle Pruden, how will direct YTP services be paid for and delivered? For example, job coaching and job development. How will we be doing VR intakes, work with VR and plans, etc. So if we go the route of Pre-ETS only, then job coaching and job development would not be a part of what a transition specialist does anymore. I know for myself and everybody that I talk to that we have great interest in also figuring out how to keep these services in our contracts because they're necessary. You all know how to do them. You do them very well. There's provider capacity issues all over the state. Just makes too much sense not to figure it out. There's a lot to figure out in 4 months. And phase one might be pre-ETS only, just so we can turn that funding stream back on. And then we might be adding on the other ones on top of that at some point in time. I'm just being incredibly honest about kind of like the urgency and amount of work that has to be done in the next couple of months to fix this so that everything can continue. We might initially just focus on pre-ETS. We might figure out how to do plan services from the get-go too. I'm not sure. We are looking at it. If we can't, in the urgent amount of time, we'll probably just be looking at pre-ETS first and then add those on later. Yes, you will still do VR intakes and plans. We will figure out how that works and looks. That's the beauty of these partnerships. We're going to figure out how that works in everything. Don't have it figured out yet. New contracts, hopefully in 23, would still be with school districts and YTP. VR would not be taking over YTP contracts, correct? Just have to make sure there is no duplication of service and that pre-ETS are being pre-authorized by VR and are being delivered. Well, they would be contracts between VR and a school district for the service. And then every school district would still have a contract with their employees. So I'm not sure which one you're asking there, but both of those elements are still the case. Tamron, since VR pays a portion of the TS wages, are TS jobs in jeopardy, such as pay decrease, possible increase? So again, Tamron, those are things that are questions for your admin and your HR because the district is your employer. In all honesty, I want them to talk to me. If they have uncertainty and doubt, I want them to call me. Call me. We can have a conversation and I can go into much greater detail than I'm able to here with this very large audience. There's some kind of business level things that we can talk about. I want them to call me if you're hearing that at all so that I can help them understand how this can potentially look with much greater detail than what we're talking about today.
I want to take one of the questions. It says, is it possible to make YTP specialists VR employees instead of school district employees? And I want to emphasize the need to have incredible resource available in schools, and that is each of you. So being able to have that direct contact with students is exactly what we desire, what our hope is in ways to continue partnering and contracting with districts. In the schools that do not have YTP, VR still has an expectation that if requests come in for individuals to request pre-ETS and they're potentially eligible for VR, we must provide that service. So one way we do that is through contracts. Another way is through our internal VR youth team. So we know that there are over 200 schools across the state, right, of students in need of services. And so those non-YTP schools, we do have assigned VR staff as well as members of our TTAN. So those transition network facilitators and those TNF transition network facilitator pre-ETS support specialists who are providing services to those students in non-YTP schools. It is not the desire of VR to go and hire additional resource and people to be employed by VR to provide these services. So we definitely are continuing to advocate and do our best to keep contracts alive and connections with students. And we have described for the last year the process that we have had to take in order to bring on 5 new staff into our program. And the way that our program structures is we must have legislative approval in which to bring over positions. So it's not as easy as saying, can all of our transition specialists be hired through VR? Because that's not the way the structure of recruitment and state service works. So we'd have to get that approval through legislation. And again, it is our energy, effort in wanting to make sure that our contracts and our partnerships still stay alive through these changes. And please have your business specialists, your contact folks connect with Michelle, and we will work out conversations to ensure that we have least impact for students receiving these services.
We are at time. I'm sorry if we didn't get to every single question. We will save the chat, and we will be creating and answering an FAQ that we can share with all of you and make sure that you have access to. We have this next session, remember, June 26th for business and admin. If you need the link to that, let me know and I will send it to you. And we have our YTP office hours every week, but every other Monday, every other Wednesday. And we hope to see you all there at those. With that, I think we will sign off today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Like,